Why is the FDA funded by the pharmaceutical industry? Why is pharma lobbying to pay billions of dollars out of pocket to fund their own regulatory agency?
ARP has been tracking prescription drug prices for more than a decade. Their latest report found the prices for the 25 most commonly used drugs under Medicare Part D have nearly doubled in price since they were first introduced.
There are some drugs in there that have seen increases of 300, close to 400%. These price increases are really dramatic. We're hearing about more and more people who are having to choose between the prescription drugs they need and other really important things like their food or their rent.
Experts point to the steep costs of brand name medications and the lack of significant price controls in the U.S.
In America, we spend more on healthcare than any other nation on Earth. Yet, our life expectancy is declining. Chronic disease rates are skyrocketing, and pharmaceutical companies are making record profits. Have you ever wondered why? What if I told you that the very agency designed to protect your health is actually captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate? That the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, has become a revolving door for pharmaceutical executives? That the drugs you're prescribed might not be as safe or effective as you've been led to believe? This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the reality of how our healthcare system operates, and it's costing Americans their health, their money, and sometimes even their lives. The relationship between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry is supposed to be one of regulator and regulated. But what happens when the line between them blurs? Dr. Patrizia Cavazzani, the former director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration, is rejoining Pfizer as chief medical officer. Cavazzani moved to the FDA from Pfizer in 2018. She resigned from the FDA in January 2025 before the second Trump administration. This revolving door between government and industry isn't new. It's a well-established pattern that undermines the FDA's credibility as a public health agency.
The pharmaceutical industry has immense power in Washington. In fact, it has 1,100 lobbyists, which is 2 lobbyists for every member of Congress. And that's why when any kind of legislation is ever introduced to try to control healthcare costs, pharmaceutical costs in particular, never even gets out of committee.
So, it's not just about individuals moving between the FDA and pharmaceutical companies. It's about how the entire system is structured. Does this mean we stop following the science and start following the money?
47% of the funding for the FDA comes from the pharmaceutical industry.
47%?
Yeah, I sent this to you. 47%. And it's funny because Bobby Kennedy got called out. He said 50%. And they said, no, it's only 47%.
Stop.
Let that sink in. Nearly half of the FDA's budget comes directly from the very companies it's supposed to be regulating. How can we expect unbiased oversight when the watchdog is being paid by those it watches? The FDA's primary job is to ensure that drugs are safe and effective before they reach the market, but the approval process has become increasingly compromised. Instead of requiring pharmaceutical companies to prove their new drugs are better than existing treatments, the FDA only requires them to be better than a placebo, a sugar pill. A congressional investigation found the FDA's interaction with Biogen were atypical and failed to follow protocol, and that the two inappropriately collaborated on documentation before the approval of Aduhelm for Alzheimer's disease. In addition, Biogen, the manufacturer of Aduhelm or aducanumab, originally set an unjustifiably high price for the drug to make history for the company, according to the executive summary of the investigation. According to internal documents, Biogen initially set the price of Aduhelm at $56,000 per year. Despite a lack of demonstrated clinical benefit, the investigation revealed that the FDA and Biogen engaged in at least 115 meetings, calls, and email exchanges over a 12-month period. More than 40 working group meetings were held, and not all were properly documented. The FDA's own internal review of the agency's approval process for Aduhelm found that the extent of collaboration between FDA and Biogen was atypical and exceeded the norm in some respects. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a system where profit motives often override public health concerns. The FDA's problems aren't limited to drugs. They extend to our food supply as well. Both the FDA and the public are unaware of how many of these ingredients, which are most commonly found in ultra-processed foods, are in our food supply. Since 1958, the FDA has been tasked with reviewing the safety of new chemicals and substances added to foods. But there's a massive loophole in the system. Initially, GROS status was intended for ingredients commonly found in foods such as vinegar and spices. But since 1997, the FDA has permitted the food industry to independently determine which substances can be considered GROS. Even for new and unfamiliar compounds, GROS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. It allows food companies to determine on their own whether additives are safe. Without FDA review, companies are not required to notify the FDA or disclose safety data for these substances, resulting in thousands of new ingredients entering the market without government scrutiny. The consequences of this self-regulation are far-reaching. The FDA's restraints on food ingredients are limited and relatively feeble, especially compared with those in Europe. There are at least 950 substances in our food that are not permitted in Europe, according to one expert's estimate. And chemicals linked to health concerns show up in hundreds of products that line the shelves of American supermarkets. Even when it comes to food packaging, the FDA has been slow to act on known dangers. A coalition of environmental groups has sued the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, over the use of highly toxic phthalates in plastic food packaging because the chemicals have been found to leach at alarming rates and present a serious health risk, especially for developing children. The lawsuit is part of an 8-year battle in which advocates have pressured the FDA to ban these chemicals from food packaging. But the agency has consistently sided with the industry, either ignoring petitions or rejecting demands to revoke a 40-year-old authorization based on outdated science. The result of this regulatory capture is a healthcare system that profits from disease rather than health.
74% of American adults now are overweight or obese. Close to 50% of children are overweight or obese. 120 years ago, when someone was obese, there were case reports written about it.
Yes.
Literally, there were people in the circus if you had obesity.
Sideshow fat. Yeah, it was so unusual.
It was so unusual. It is now 74% of our country. 77% of young adults are unfit to serve in the military because of these issues like obesity.
And it's not just obesity and these chronic diseases. They are incredibly profitable for pharmaceutical companies. A patient with diabetes isn't cured. They're managed with medications for life.
The medicalization of chronic disease has been the deadliest and most expensive mistake in modern American history. There has never been a chronic disease treatment that's lowered rates of the chronic disease it's trying to treat.
This creates a perverse incentive structure where the healthcare industry profits from sickness rather than health.
Name a chronic condition and the drug for it. Statins, heart disease. The more statins we prescribe, the more heart disease goes up. Metformin and diabetes. The more metformin we prescribe, the more diabetes goes up. SSRIs, antidepressants, the most prescribed class of drugs in America. 25% of women are on some kind of antidepressant. Obviously, suicide and depression is skyrocketing.
The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable in the world, and they spend billions to keep it that way. From 2007 to 2016, Pharma spent $2.4 billion lobbying Congress, averaging $450,000 per member of Congress each year. This lobbying has real consequences for policy. One of the most egregious examples was the passage of Medicare Part D in 2003. The legislation was rushed through Congress with lawmakers given little time to review the massive bill before voting. The central feature of Medicare Part D, and the one most beneficial to pharmaceutical companies, was the prohibition on Medicare negotiating drug prices. Think about that. The U.S. government, the largest purchaser of prescription drugs in the world, is legally barred from using its bargaining power to secure better prices. We negotiate prices for everything else the government buys: military equipment, office supplies, construction contracts, but not prescription drugs. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate policy choice secured through incentive lobbying. The result? Americans pay far more for prescription drugs than people in any other developed country. The same medications often cost 2 to 10 times more in the US than in Canada, Europe, or Japan. This price differential isn't because drugs cost more to produce for the American market, it's because the pharmaceutical companies can charge whatever they want, and our government has tied its own hands. The pharmaceutical industry enjoys numerous other advantages as well: monopoly patents, investment tax credits, accelerated depreciation, and generally lower tax rates than other industries. All of these factors contribute to the extraordinary profitability at the expense of American patients. There's another layer to the story, the connection between our food system and the pharmaceutical industry.
The food and the pharmaceutical industry, which profits from kids being metabolic dysfunctional, are two of the largest industries in the country. And the fundamental dynamic that we have is what's happening with kids is unprecedented.
Processed food industry and pharmaceutical companies have a symbiotic relationship. One makes us sick, the other sells us drugs to manage the symptoms.
The biggest issue in the world, in my opinion, is the devil's bargain, where food is making us sick. We're getting addicted and it's making us sick. And then the medical system is profiting from the fact that everyone's getting sick.
This connection isn't accidental. It's by design. The food industry uses similar tactics to influence health organizations. The American Diabetes Association, which sets standards of care for diabetes management, receives funding from companies like Coca-Cola and Cadbury. Until 2018, the ADA didn't even have dietary guidelines for diabetics, suggesting that people could eat whatever they wanted as long as they took their medications. This influence extends to medical education as well. 90% of medical schools in the United States, including prestigious institutions like Stanford or Harvard, don't require a single nutrition class for graduation. Doctors receive extensive training in pharmacology, but minimal education on how diet affects health. This creates a medical culture focused on treating symptoms with drugs rather than addressing root causes through lifestyle changes. The result is a healthcare system where the standard response to metabolic conditions is medication, not nutrition. Patients with high cholesterol get statins, those with high blood pressure get antihypertensives, and those with high blood sugar get metformin, all without meaningful discussion of how dietary changes might address the underlying issues. Behind all of these statistics and corporate practices are real people suffering real consequences. Consider the story of one woman who trusted the healthcare system completely only to be let down in the end. She had her children late in life, giving birth to 12-pound babies, a condition called fetal macrosomia, which is a clear sign of metabolic dysfunction. But instead of addressing the underlying metabolic issues, her doctors simply noted the large babies and moved on. As she aged, she developed the typical American health profile: high cholesterol, high blood pressure, high blood sugar. For each condition, she received a prescription: statins for cholesterol, lisinopril for blood pressure, metformin for blood sugar. Her doctors reassured her that this was normal, just the typical rite of passage of aging in America. She followed all the medical advice she was given, took all her prescribed medications faithfully, and saw all the recommended specialists. Then, one day, she experienced abdominal pain. After a few weeks, she got a CT scan that revealed stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 13 days later, she was dead. These early warning signs were missed or ignored by the healthcare system. This story is repeated millions of times across America. People trust the healthcare system, follow their doctor's advice, take their medications, and still get sicker. But there is another way. A growing movement of doctors, researchers, and patients are challenging the pharmaceutical-centered approach to healthcare.
You know, I'm in the operating room in my 5th year of my surgical residency, and I'm looking down at a patient in front of me who's on our 3rd revision sinus surgery. And, you know, I know how to diagnose her, I know how to write the prescriptions, I know how to do the surgery, but what I kind of realized in that moment was like, I have no idea why this patient's actually sick.
Dr. Casey Means, a Stanford-trained surgeon, made the radical decision to leave her surgical career to focus on addressing the root causes of disease.
And I realized that there's a huge problem in how we're practicing medicine right now, which is we're ignoring the root causes of why Americans are sick, and we're profiting off of patients getting sick and then doing things to them. That's the way the business model of healthcare works, you know.
This alternative approach focuses on addressing the underlying metabolic dysfunction that drives most chronic diseases. The evidence for this approach is growing. Studies show that dietary interventions can reverse type 2 diabetes in many cases. Exercise has been shown to be as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression, with fewer side effects. Addressing sleep and stress can improve everything from heart health to immune function. These aren't fringe ideas. They're supported by robust scientific research. They're just not profitable for pharmaceutical companies. So what can you do to protect yourself and your family in a system that often prioritizes profit over health? The first step is to become an informed consumer of healthcare. Start with your diet. The food you eat has a profound impact on your metabolic health. Focus on whole, unprocessed foods and minimize what some experts call the unholy trinity. Seed oils like soybean, canola, and sunflower oils, highly processed grains, and added sugars. These three ingredients, which have become ubiquitous in the American diet over the past century, are major drivers of metabolic dysfunction. Movement is also crucial. You don't need an elaborate exercise regimen. Just 150 minutes of moderate activity per week can make a significant difference. This could be walking, swimming, cycling, dancing, or any other activity that gets your heart rate up. Consistency matters more than intensity. Prioritize sleep and stress management. Poor sleep and chronic stress both contribute to metabolic dysfunction and increase the risk of chronic disease. Aim for 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep per night and incorporate stress reduction practices like meditation, deep breathing, or time in nature. When it comes to medications, be an informed consumer. Ask questions. What is this medication treating? Are there non-pharmaceutical alternatives? What are the potential side effects? How long will I need to take it? Is there evidence that it improves long-term outcomes, not just symptoms? This doesn't mean rejecting all medications. Some are truly life-saving, particularly for acute conditions. But for chronic conditions, consider whether the medication is addressing the root cause or just managing symptoms. And be wary of taking multiple medications that might interact in unpredictable ways.
The reasons why Americans are getting sicker every year are very simple. Americans want to be healthy. Americans do not want to die early. They do not want to see their kids with all these chronic health issues like autism and food allergies and obesity and prediabetes and 40% of teens with mental health issues. No one wants this, but the system is rigged against the American patient to create diseases and then profit off of them.
Individual actions are important, but systemic change is also necessary. Our healthcare system is fundamentally broken, and fixing it will require policy reforms at multiple levels. We need to address the conflicts of interest that pervade our healthcare system. This includes reforming how the FDA is funded and governed. As long as the agency depends on pharmaceutical companies for nearly half of its budget, it will struggle to regulate them effectively. We need an independent FDA funded entirely by taxpayers with strict rules against the revolving door between industry and government. The gross loophole for food additives needs to be closed. Companies should be required to prove the safety of all ingredients before they enter the food supply with independent verification of their data. And the FDA should have the authority to quickly remove ingredients when safety concerns arise, rather than allowing years or decades of litigation while people continue to be exposed. The story of how Big Pharma controls the FDA to keep us sick is disturbing. But it's not the end of the story. By understanding the system, we can begin to change it. The path forward begins with awareness. Share this video, talk to your friends and family, question the status quo. Together, we can create a healthcare system that truly prioritizes health over profit. One that addresses the root causes of disease rather than just managing symptoms. One that empowers people to take control of their own health.
My message is the system is rigged. You should trust yourself, and it's simple. It is simple. Cut those 3 ingredients, move, see what happens. It's simple. Like, don't be gaslighted that this is complicated. I've seen the efforts inside the system to try to convince you of that, and it's just not true. This is dead simple. That is my message.
The choice is yours. Will you continue to accept a system that profits from your illness? Or will you join the growing movement for real health and healing?